March 17, 1944, somewhere above the frozen clouds of northern Europe, a lone B-17 limps through the sky with smoke trailing from 2 engines and 12 Bf-109s closing in like vultures. Inside the tail section, Sergeant William Harper knows he has less than 4 minutes before the German fighters tear the bomber apart. No one expects a gunner to survive an attack like this, much less change the future of air combat, but Harper is already preparing something his crew will later call a suicidal maneuver. The bomber shudders as the first 109 dives. Harper doesn't wait. He unstraps, swings his entire body out of the tail gunner's seat, and angles the guns into a position no manual ever approved. It's reckless. It breaks every rule. But it gives him a firing arc the enemy never imagined. The Germans press in, unaware that his next 4 minutes will enter aviation legend. The winter of 1944 had twisted the air war into something brutal and unpredictable. Germany's fighter force, though shrinking, still possessed some of the most experienced pilots in the world. Their Bf-109s, fast, agile and lethal at altitude, stalked American bomber formations with a single objective: break the box, isolate a straggler, and destroy it before escort fighters could intervene. Every crewman in the 8th Air Force knew the pattern. Once a bomber fell behind, it became a floating coffin. Sergeant William Harper understood this better than most. He had flown 11 missions as a tail gunner, each one carving another layer of caution into his instincts. The tail was the loneliest place in a fortress of aluminum. It shook violently in turbulence, burned first when a German cannon round struck home, and offered no protection if the aircraft broke apart. Yet Harper chose it willingly. He believed that the survival of the entire crew often depended on the man sitting in that cramped, freezing bubble. From the moment the B-17 lifted off, Harper's world shrank to a narrow tunnel of glass and steel. He watched contrails form above enemy territory, gauged distant glints of sunlight for signs of fighters, and counted seconds between engine coughs when flak smoke thickened the air. His training taught him discipline: short bursts to conserve ammunition, predictable arcs of fire, coordinated calls over intercom. But experience had shown him something training manuals never admitted. German fighter pilots studied tail gunners just as closely. They knew the angles, the blind spots, and the moments when a gunner hesitated. And hesitation killed. Early in the war, American gunners relied on the strength of tight formations. Dozens of B-17s interlocked their fields of fire so effectively that Luftwaffe commanders once called them flying hedgehogs. But by 1944, attrition, weather, and mechanical strain often tore holes in these formations. One bomber losing an engine could drift minutes behind the pack, long enough for German interceptors to swarm it without risking counterfire from the rest of the group. Harper's crew had seen this happen. They watched other stragglers vanish into the clouds trailing smoke, followed by bursts of flame that marked another 8 or 10 airmen gone. They spoke quietly about it during briefings, hiding their fear under nervous jokes. Yet none of them forgot that if their own bomber ever slowed, the entire weight of the Luftwaffe would come crashing down on them. The crew wasn't inexperienced. Their pilot, Lieutenant Clarence Maddox, was known for his steady hands. Their navigator could thread them through fog with a compass that barely worked. Their waist gunners had nerves hardened by raids over Brunswick and Bremen. Still, every man aboard knew the same truth. Once isolated, skill meant little. Survival depended on moments, split-second decisions that turned chaos into opportunity. Harper started studying those moments. He kept mental notes of fighter approach patterns, angles of attack, and the split-second window where a German pilot committed to a firing run. He tested tiny adjustments in firing stance, shifting weight or repositioning straps to give him just a fraction more control. Other gunners might shrug off these habits as superstition, but Harper believed that one day actions measured in inches and seconds might decide whether his crew lived to see England again. What he didn't know was that a mission in March would force him to break every habit he'd ever learned, and in doing so redefine what a tail gunner could do. The morning of March 17, 1944 began with a silence that felt wrong. The crews at Thorpe Abbotts usually filled the briefing hall with chatter, boots scraping, someone coughing through a cigarette, someone else whispering about leave 2 weeks away. But on this morning, the men of the 352nd Bomb Squadron sat still, listening to the low hum of tension that spread across the room like fog. The map at the front showed a deep strike into northern Germany, longer, riskier, and well within reach of Luftwaffe interception. Red strings marked enemy airfields lined with units known for their aggression. Harper recognized one symbol immediately: JG-26, the fighter group whose Bf-109s were notorious for coordinated tail attacks. He stared at the symbol longer than the others. They were the ones who dissected bomber weaknesses with surgical precision, and the ones rumored to have adopted new firing methods at steep dive angles. Lieutenant Maddox glanced toward his crew, reading their expressions with the detached calm of a man who had learned to hide his own fear. "We stay tight. We stay disciplined. And we don't let them split us from the formation." Harper nodded but kept his thoughts buried. Discipline only helped when the formation held. When engines failed, when flak tore metal apart, when someone lost airspeed in a climb, discipline shattered and chaos filled the gaps. They marched out toward their aircraft, a battle-worn B-17 named Bellringer. Frost clung to its wings and thin white scales. The crew chief performed his final walk-around, his gloved hand tapping each rivet line on habit. Harper paused before climbing into the tail, letting the cold burn through the fabric of his uniform. He felt the usual vibration rising through the fuselage as the engines roared awake. The sound never comforted him. It reminded him of everything that could go wrong. Inside the tail compartment, Harper settled into the cramped position he trained his body to endure. He adjusted the twin .50 caliber Brownings, checked feed belts, tested the firing solenoids and locked his harness. A sharp routine, but this time his hands lingered on the straps. He tightened them, loosened them, adjusted the anchor points. Something in him sensed that today would not follow the predictable rhythm of escort sweeps and flak bursts. The bomber lifted into pale morning light, joining the long column of aircraft climbing in slow spirals. From his vantage point, the sky looked like a painting fractured by contrails. Harper scanned every glint and shadow. He listened for subtle tones in the engines. He kept track of the distance between Bellringer and the bombers ahead. Early signs often whispered before they screamed. Hours passed in cold vigilance. Flak clouds appeared first, black blossoms erupting from batteries far below. Maddox called for a minor corrective turn. Their formation tightened. The aircraft jerked as bursts detonated too close for comfort. The smell of cordite seeped through cracks in the fuselage, mixing with the metallic scent of heated gun barrels. Harper braced, waiting for the inevitable moment when German fighters burst through the flak screen. When they came as shadows first, fast, needle-shaped streaks diving from the sun. "Fighters. 11 o'clock high." The call rippled through the formation like electricity. Each bomber adjusted instinctively, but the attack was coordinated, precise. Bf-109 slashed through the high group, then banked sharply, preparing a second run that targeted the rear clusters where damaged stragglers always formed. Bellringer held its position, until Engine 3 coughed. It was a small cough at first, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't listening for it. But Harper heard it. He closed his eyes for a second and felt the shift, the slight drop in speed, the subtle nose tilt that indicated drag. Then the second cough came, louder, uglier, and the engine sputtered as black smoke streamed behind them. "Engine 3 losing power," Maddox announced with forced calm. The formation crept forward. Bellringer fell back. Harper's heartbeat tightened into a dull, heavy rhythm. The thing every bomber crew dreaded was unfolding, slowly, mercilessly, with the certainty of gravity. "Try to hold her, Clarence," the co-pilot muttered. "Just keep her with the pack." But the pack was moving away. Invisible threads were stretching between aircraft, thinning, loosening, snapping. Within minutes, they were alone, or close enough that the surrounding firepower no longer protected them. From the clouds below, the Bf-109s reappeared. Harper counted them. Not 3. Not 5. 12. They formed a staggered attack column, a pattern he had seen only once before. Months earlier, when a similar group had dismantled a trailing bomber in less than 2 minutes. The Germans moved with studied confidence, adjusting altitude, spacing, and speed. They knew Bellringer's engines were struggling. They knew she could not outrun them. And they knew the tail gunner would be their first target. Harper steadied his breathing. He tested his firing handles again. He leaned forward, aligning the guns with the approach path. The first pair of fighters began their dive, engines howling through the thin air. He waited one heartbeat longer than instinct demanded, tracking not the lead fighter but the trailing one. The pilot who expected the gunner to panic, to fire too early, to waste ammunition. Harper's guns erupted with short, precise bursts. The tracers stitched the sky just ahead of the fighter's nose. The pilot jerked away, breaking formation, and the coordination of the first attack faltered. But the other fighters adjusted instantly. A second pair dived in. Harper swung left. The bomber bucked beneath him, forcing him to readjust quickly. One burst. Two. His rounds chipped metal but did not break through. The fighters split around the bomber, regrouping for another run. Over the intercom came the clipped voice of the top turret gunner. "They're reforming for a bracket pattern. They want the tail." Harper already knew. And he also knew the standard defensive arc would give him only a few degrees of coverage, far too narrow against 12 fighters moving like a pack of wolves. He watched the 109s shift again. Their leader pulled high, checking speed, setting the rhythm for a synchronized lethal run. The line of fighters began to stretch across the sky in a curve that would allow them to alternate firing passes, one after another, never giving Bellringer a moment to recover. Harper tightened his grip on the handles. He knew the math. Even if he hit the first 2 or 3, the others would slip through. The bomber's weakened engines could not absorb the damage. 4 minutes, at best, before cannon shells tore the tail clean off. A strange calm settled over him. Not acceptance. Not defeat. Something sharper. He remembered a moment from months earlier. A damaged bomber weaving unpredictably, its tail gunner firing from an odd angle, surprising the German pilot who thought he knew the blind spots. That gunner died days later, but his strange adjustment had stuck in Harper's mind. An idea rose suddenly, shocking him with its clarity. A firing angle no manual approved. A movement no instructor would allow. A position so dangerous that it bordered on suicidal. But it offered a wider arc. A deadlier arc. One the Germans did not expect. He glanced at the straps across his chest. Then he made a decision. Harper unlatched his harness. The bomber lurched and he steadied himself with one hand. He twisted his body, forcing both shoulders out of the seat framework, planting one boot against the tail's lower frame. The guns shifted with him. Their barrels angled wider, deeper, covering a field that tail gunners were never supposed to reach. "Harper, what the hell are you doing?" Maddox shouted through the intercom. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The Germans began their run. The lead 109 dove in a perfect, practiced arc. Harper waited, silent, still, suspended in a position that exposed his entire torso to the incoming fire. Then, in one controlled motion, he pulled the triggers. The Brownings roared with a violence he felt in his teeth. Tracers fanned across the sky, not in a straight line but in a sweeping burst that caught the lead 109 precisely as the pilot committed. The fighter flared, clipped by rounds that punctured the coolant lines. It spiraled down, trailing vapor and smoke. The second pilot hesitated. The third adjusted altitude. The fourth shifted too late. The bomber crew shouted updates through the intercom, but Harper barely heard them. He was moving with the fluidity of instinct and desperation, no longer bound by the constraints of the tail gunner's seat. He shifted angles, widened arcs, used recoil to pivot his body. The guns blazed, each burst controlled yet aggressive. Rounds struck another fighter's wing root. The 109 snapped left sharply, losing control as the pilot bailed out. A third dove too steeply and took a burst through the canopy, flipping into a deadly tumble. Harper's position was punishing. Every vibration rattled his bones. Every evasive maneuver of the bomber threatened to throw him off balance. He clung to the gun frame with raw determination. But it was working. And the German pilots realized it too late. The moment Harper unlatched his harness, the battle shifted from predictable geometry to raw human instinct. The Luftwaffe pilots had expected a trapped gunner, strapped tightly into a fixed arc of fire, relying on training that emphasized discipline over improvisation. Instead, they found a man fighting from a position no manual prepared them for, half-suspended, half-balanced, twisting his body into angles that rewrote the bomber's defensive footprint. But Harper didn't feel brave. He felt the bomber's trembling metal under his boots, the bitter cold slicing through his gloves, the thin pressure in his ears as altitude battered his senses. He wasn't performing a tactic, he was reacting to the inevitable. Bellringer dropped another few feet as Maddox tried to coax lift from weakened engines. The flak bursts faded behind them, leaving only white sky, frost, and the sharp, predatory shapes of the 12 remaining Bf 109s preparing their next synchronized strike. The German leader, a veteran Hauptmann with over 30 victories, tightened his formation. He had fought American bombers long enough to recognize unusual behavior. He noticed the tail guns shifting too widely. He noticed tracers fanning unpredictably. And he noticed the small discrepancy in the bomber's silhouette, something moving where no gunner should be moving. He flagged his wingmen with a quick roll of his aircraft, signaling a change in approach. Instead of a straight dive, they adjusted into a scissor pattern assault designed for overwhelming fire on a fixed defensive point. It was a tactic meant to corner trapped gunners, not adaptable ones. The Germans believed they were tightening a noose. Harper felt the shift even without seeing the signal. He saw how the fighters spread, how they angled their noses, how sunlight caught their canopies in a way that told him they were preparing a cascading attack. One fighter drawing his fire, two more striking from blind spots, another finishing the job at close range. A methodical dance of death. He braced his knees against the gun frame and leaned further out, stretching for more reach. His body protested. Pain shot up his spine. His right hand slipped once, and only a desperate grab prevented him from sliding entirely off his position. The bomber's skin was cold as ice. One mistake could send him crashing backward with nothing to hold onto. But the new angle gave him a view he had never seen so clearly before, a direct line into the oncoming German formation. The lead fighter committed first. The maneuver was beautiful in its precision. A shallow dive, a throttle burst, and a smooth curvature that brought the 109 directly into firing range. The pilot expected the B-17 to hold steady. Expected the tail gun to track only horizontally. Expected a short burst of defensive fire too late to alter the attack. Harper swung the Brownings up, not sideways. The tracers tore through the cold air in a rising line that intersected the 109's glide perfectly. It was a shot that no standard firing position allowed. The Germans' wings rocked violently. Smoke poured from the engine. The aircraft twisted out of formation, flames licking the fuselage. The second fighter hesitated, thrown off rhythm. The third overcorrected and dropped too low. The fourth adjusted too sharply, leaving a thin glare of vulnerability along the starboard wing root. Harper didn't wait. He shifted again, forcing his shoulder against the lower bulkhead and twisting his torso toward the rightmost vector. His ribs scraped metal. His boots nearly lost grip. But the guns followed his movements like extensions of his own arms. The next burst was short, controlled, devastating. Rounds shattered the canopy of the low-flying 109. The pilot slumped forward. The fighter flipped into a shallow dive and disappeared beneath the bomber's tail. That's three, Harper thought, but counting only distracted him. Numbers were meaningless here. Time was meaningless. Only angles, distances, and breaths mattered. The German leader saw his formation fragmenting. He barked a correction into his radio and banked hard left, signaling a reset. His pilots obeyed, pulling back into a tight circular climb that would allow them to regroup for a high-angle, coordinated strike, one designed to overwhelm any single defensive gunner. It was a tactic based on certainty. Certainty that the bomber would continue flying straight. Certainty that tail gunners stayed strapped into fixed positions. Certainty that predictability was the American weakness. But nothing about Harper was predictable anymore. Inside the bomber, the crew felt the shift but couldn't see him. The waist gunners shouted into their mics, unsure if Harper was wounded, unconscious, or simply fighting silently. Maddox tried to steady the bomber, terrified that one hard jolt would throw Harper from his position. "Harper! Sound off," the radio operator pleaded. But Harper ignored the calls. Speaking required breath, and breath was something he could not spare. The German leader rolled his fighter until the sun glowed behind him in a perfect blinding halo. It was a classic Luftwaffe tactic. Attack out of the light, force the gunner to squint, to lose sight for those critical seconds when tracers should be finding their mark. Harper dropped his chin, letting his helmet rim shield his eyes. The leader committed to the attack. He came in fast, disciplined, certain that this run would break the bomber's defense. His wingmen followed in staggered rhythm, lining themselves like falling dominoes, each ready to unleash cannon fire the moment Harper engaged someone else. For a heartbeat, the sky fell silent. Then Harper did something no German pilot had ever trained to anticipate. Instead of aiming at the lead fighter approaching dead center, he aimed at the second. His guns roared to life, meeting the second fighter mid-dive. The pilot jerked violently, thrown off balance by a burst that shattered his left aileron. His aircraft rolled unexpectedly, directly into the path of the lead fighter. The two 109s collided. Metal tore metal. Fuel erupted. The twin fireballs spiraled downward, leaving oily smoke trails that twisted like black ropes against the bright sky. 4 down. The remaining German pilots scattered. A collision on an attack run was rare, almost unheard of. To see two experienced pilots collide was enough to break formation discipline entirely. Harper's chest ached. His breath came in ragged, painful draws. His arms trembled against the recoil. But he stayed locked in place, eyes burning, refusing to blink as the surviving fighters began circling in confusion. He knew confusion wouldn't last. The German leader, now without his immediate wingmen, pulled out of the debris cloud, engine screaming, anger replacing calculation. He didn't climb. He didn't regroup. He dove straight in, determined to avenge the chaos Harper had created. Harper watched the dive. He felt the angle. He judged the distance. And he understood with chilling clarity, this attack wouldn't follow any pattern. This was a veteran pilot abandoning discipline for fury. Harper adjusted his stance, bracing harder than before. The bomber shook as Maddox fought to keep altitude. Frosted aluminum vibrated under his boots. His gloves stiffened against the cold and sweat mixing inside. The German fired first. White streaks of cannon rounds ripped past Harper's position, exploding into the fuselage just feet from his legs. The shockwave rattled his bones. Fragments sparked around him like tiny meteors. Still he held. The German closed in rapidly, too rapidly for a conventional defense. Harper waited until he could see frost forming on the 109's propeller cone. He squeezed the triggers one more time. And the turning point deepened. The moment Harper pulled the triggers, the world narrowed into a tunnel of noise, fire, and recoil. The Brownings screamed at full rhythm, their barrels spitting tracers that arced upward into the diving 109. The fighter came in with terrifying speed, its silhouette growing until Harper felt he could reach out and touch it. Every instinct begged him to duck, to pull back into the safety of the tail frame. But he held steady, arms locked, legs braced, chest burning with the effort of keeping his body suspended in that unnatural, dangerous position. The first round struck the German's left wing root. The metal shimmered as pieces of skin tore loose into the slipstream. Smoke burst from beneath the cowling. The pilot tried to correct, banking hard, but the damage was already too severe. At that speed, even a minor structural failure turned fatal. The 109 jolted violently, rolled onto its side, and sheared away beneath the bomber in a catastrophic plunge. Harper exhaled once, just once, before the next danger surged forward. The remaining fighters regrouped with ruthless efficiency. The German leader's second element took command instantly, forming a loose pincer designed to exploit Harper's exhausted firing angles. They didn't commit to full dives this time. Instead, they tested him, quick feints, half approaches, sudden breaks, to gauge how his new, unconventional position changed his reaction time. Harper recognized the probing pattern. He had seen it in training films, though never this aggressive. The Germans were learning him. They were adapting. His trick, brilliant as it was, would not work forever. He shifted his stance again, wedging one elbow into a narrow structural ridge to create a pseudo-brace. It hurt, deep, stabbing pain radiating from shoulder to spine, but it granted him a fraction more control. The fighters attacked. The first 109 streaked past in a blur, cannon rounds flashing like silver teeth along the bomber's flank. Harper tracked it but didn't fire, the angle was too steep. The second fighter dove a second later, believing Harper's delay was weakness. It wasn't. Harper snapped the guns up and right, a movement so sharp it sent pain slicing across his ribs. The burst caught the 109's tailplane. It didn't destroy the aircraft, but it destabilized the pilot's dive. The fighter wobbled, overcorrected, and slid directly into the firing path of the top turret. A split second later, the turret gunners .50 calories opened fire, shredding the 109 from above. A fiery bloom blossomed in the sky. 6 down. The German pilots finally realized they had underestimated the bomber. They widened formation, seeking altitude advantage. They abandoned the coordinated pattern, each pilot improvising based on instinct and opportunity, dangerous for them, far more dangerous for Harper. Without pattern, without rhythm, attacks came unpredictably from every direction. Harper could no longer anticipate them. He could only react. A sudden jolt shook the bomber as the next fighter screamed from below. Harper didn't see it until the last second, a black shape rising like a shark from the deep. He swung his guns down, nearly losing his grip entirely. The burst he fired was late, too late to drive the attacker off course. Cannon shells ripped into the bomber's underside, bursting panels, sending fragments spinning through the fuselage. The bomber lurched violently. Harper's boots slid. His torso jerked backward, far enough that for a brief, sickening moment, he hung suspended in midair with no point of contact except his left hand gripping the gun frame. Wind roared around him. Fabric tore. His glove ripped at the palm. He pulled himself forward with a desperate grunt, forcing his shoulder back into position just as the fighter climbed past the tail. His body trembled. His breath seized. But he wasn't done. The fighter banked for another run, confident that the bomber was crippled and the gunner shaken. This time Harper waited. He waited until he could see the shimmer of sunlight on the pilot's goggles. Then he fired the cleanest burst of the entire battle. The tracers connected with surgical accuracy. The 109 didn't explode. It simply died, engine seizing, wings stiffening, the nose dipping as gravity claimed it. 7. Inside the bomber, the crew didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They could hear everything happening behind them. Every round, every engine strain, every vibration. They knew Harper was fighting beyond physical limits, beyond anything the tail compartment was designed to allow. They also knew he wouldn't last much longer. Another pair of 109s descended. These pilots were not inexperienced. They coordinated silently, positioning themselves on parallel approach vectors that minimized Harper's chances of hitting both. If he targeted the left fighter, the right would slip through. If he targeted the right, the left would rake the tail clean off. Harper didn't pick one. He picked both. He angled his guns not at either aircraft, but at the narrow imaginary line between them, a place where defensive fire forced both pilots to react simultaneously. The tactic shouldn't have worked. But it did. The left 109 veered away first, startled by the unexpected pattern. The right pilot, trying to compensate, banked just a little too sharply. That shift exposed the underbelly for less than a second, but it was enough. Harper fired. The rounds tore into the engine cowling. Flames erupted. The fighter broke into a rolling descent and vanished in a smear of black smoke. The surviving pilot of the pair leveled out, stunned by how rapidly the engagement was deteriorating. He broke off entirely, climbing high into the thinning air. 3 fighters remained. For the first time, Harper felt his strength fading. His arms ached so badly he could barely lift them. His fingers tingled from the vibration. His ears rang from the relentless thunder of the guns. Blood trickled down his forearm where jagged metal had scraped skin raw. Time stretched. Seconds felt like minutes. Each breath shuddered in his chest. But stopping meant death. The remaining fighters circled, tightening an invisible ring around Bellringer. These last pilots were veterans, men who had survived hundreds of combat hours. They would not make amateur mistakes. They would not be rattled by fear or chaos. They would finish the job methodically. The first survivor dove with perfect discipline, committing to a straight pass that maximized firing time. Harper fired, but his aim was weakening, his shoulders shaking with exhaustion. He missed by inches, the tracers slipping beneath the 109's fuselage. Cannon fire ripped into the bomber's tail, shredding fabric, punching holes through metal. Harper felt debris sting his arms and face. He tasted blood. He blinked sweat and dust from his eyes, refusing to collapse. The fighter banked for another run. The second survivor swept wide left, setting up a crossing attack. Harper knew he couldn't track both. Not in his condition. Not in this position. The third survivor, the last ace in the group, climbed directly behind the bomber, positioning himself perfectly to exploit Harper's blind spot. He waited patiently, professionally, coldly. 3 angles. 3 threats. 1 exhausted gunner. Harper inhaled once, deeply, ignoring the pain flooding his ribs. He watched the fighters' movement, not their paths but their timing. He sensed their rhythm. The tiny fluctuations of throttle. The slope of their dives. The split-second window where their attack vectors overlapped. And suddenly, he understood something with shocking clarity. All 3 fighters would cross into one narrow firing window. For less than half a second. But long enough. Harper adjusted. He braced. He pulled the triggers. And the climax ignited. The sky above northern Europe had transformed into a living battlefield. Frosted contrails traced the desperate arcs of 12 German fighters as they circled Bellringer, hunting for weakness. Smoke streaked the bomber's fuselage where cannon rounds had torn through metal. Frost and debris clung to Harper's uniform, freezing sweat to cold metal. Yet inside that cramped tail compartment, suspended half out of the gunner's seat, Sergeant William Harper had reached the apex of human focus. A state of clarity born from fear, instinct, and impossible necessity. 3 fighters remained. The previous 8 lay scattered across the sky below in smoke trails and spiraling wrecks. Harper could see them even now. Flames licking fuselages, metal twisting unnaturally, pilots abandoned to gravity. The sight should have spurred relief, but there was no time. Relief meant distraction. Distraction meant death. The remaining trio were not ordinary. They were veterans, calculated, unyielding, professionals who had faced countless bombers and returned to fight again. This was the crucible. This was the moment that would define the battle, the mission, and Harper's life. He felt the bomber shudder violently as the first of the 3 struck in a steep dive, engines screaming. The pilot had chosen a high-angle attack, banking slightly to the right to avoid the position Harper had been exploiting. Recoil tore through Harper's arms as he aimed, every muscle trembling. He fired a short, precise burst. Tracers stitched the sky, connecting with the 109's wing root, causing it to tilt violently. Smoke erupted. The fighter spun, veering off course, barely recovering before it plummeted below, its engine coughing in protest. 1 down. 2 to go. The second 109 reacted instantly. It rose above, attempting a flanking maneuver that would intersect Harper's blind side. The pilot banked sharply, compensating for the altered bomber trajectory. Harper's body, pinned half out of the tail compartment, twisted with him. His gloves scraped metal. His fingers cramped on the triggers. He fired. The tracers carved a diagonal arc through the sunlight, striking the fighter's propeller assembly. The aircraft wobbled, guns flaring from defensive bursts. The pilot fought to regain control, but the engine seized. It spiraled into a twisting tumble, black smoke trailing like a ribbon. 2 down. The final fighter was the most dangerous, the German leader. Unlike his wingmen, he wasn't panicked, rash, or improvising. He assessed. Calculated. He had survived the chaos Harper had created so far and now sought to correct it systematically. He aligned his dive carefully, timing his descent to catch Harper's arc as the B-17 lurched on weakened engines. If Harper misjudged by even a fraction of a second, the tail, and Harper, would be gone. Time dilated. Every second stretched into an eternity. Harper's chest burned from effort, his arms trembling from continuous recoil, every nerve screaming in exhaustion. He felt the strain of 4 previous minutes compounded, his body aching in places he hadn't known could hurt. Yet there was no thought of giving up. Survival, instinct, duty, all fused into singular, piercing clarity. The German leader dove from above, sunlight glinting off the canopy. Harper counted the milliseconds, aligning the guns at an angle no training ever recommended. The B-17's fuselage shuddered as flak hits further rattled the metal. Maddox struggled to maintain altitude, the engines barely keeping the bomber airborne. Harper leaned harder, legs braced, elbows grinding against rivets. Every ounce of pain focused his aim. The first burst tore into the 109's left wing, ripping metal and control surfaces apart. The pilot flailed. The aircraft swerved wildly, smoke spewing. But it was still moving, still a threat. Harper adjusted instantly. He shifted his body further out, leveraging gravity to swing the guns in a controlled arc. He fired again. Tracers streaked like silver lightning, slicing the air. The engine coughed, then died. The 109 spiraled, its wings folding in unnatural angles as the pilot bailed out. Smoke and flame carved a trail against the sky. 3. All gone. The entire battle was now silent in a way only extreme intensity allows. Silence made of anticipation, fear, and the thin metallic whine of stress on metal. Harper hung in that precarious position, muscles screaming, blood pounding in his ears, breath shallow. His arms trembled with exhaustion, his body battered by cold, vibration, and relentless recoil. He could have lost consciousness, he could have slipped and plummeted to the earth below. Yet he remained. Focused. Alive. Deadly. The line between survival and death was invisible, a thin edge of perception that Harper now walked with every heartbeat. From below, Maddox barked a warning as flak erupted again, shaking the bomber violently. Harper ignored it. There was no time for flinching. No room for hesitation. He knew the last few German pilots were searching for him, calculating angles, waiting for mistakes. This was the final push, the apex of the fight, and Harper understood with absolute certainty. The next 4 seconds would determine everything. The German leader's final maneuver was brilliant. He rose high, then twisted into a reverse dive attack designed to intercept Harper's newly established firing arc precision, experience, instinct. The pilot counted on Harper being human, exhausted, imperfect. The B-17 trembled beneath the maneuver. Harper braced harder, felt the vibration through his gloves, and fired a measured burst, leading the fighter precisely. For a heartbeat, it was beautiful and terrifying. The round struck the 109's fuselage just behind the cockpit, destabilizing the engine and damaging control surfaces. Smoke erupted. The plane wobbled, tilted, and then the pilot bailed, ejecting into open sky. The last fighter was no longer a threat. Harper's body trembled with exhaustion as he slumped partially back into the seat frame, unable to fully stand but alive. The German attack was over. The aftermath was almost surreal. The sky, which had been a chaos of tracers, smoke and roaring engines, now held only the limp, battered bomber and distant black trails marking defeated Bf-109s. Harper's hands shook uncontrollably, but he could see the full scope of what had just occurred. 12 enemy fighters had been neutralized in just over 4 minutes. His unconventional maneuver, The position that broke all rules, defied manuals and risked his life had worked. It had not only saved the bomber and crew but rewritten the playbook of defensive tail gunnery. Inside Bellringer the crew was stunned. Voices cracked over the intercom, disbelief mixing with relief. Maddox struggled to steady the plane, finally bringing it back to a stable course as Harper collapsed fully into the tail seat, chest heaving, fingers numb, sweat and blood streaked across his face. But it wasn't just survival. It was triumph. The victory was absolute in its terror and clarity. A single gunner had faced overwhelming odds, defied expectations and prevailed. The lesson was clear. The rules of aerial engagement had changed. German tactics, honed over years, had been dismantled by improvisation, instinct and raw courage. Harper had demonstrated that a tail gunner was not just a stationary defender but a potential game-changer, an active participant capable of shaping the outcome of entire encounters. The bomber continued its flight, engines straining but intact. Harper's hands rested on the cold metal of the gun frame, shaking yet alive, his mind slowly registering the magnitude of what had happened. He glanced briefly through the tail window at the distant trails of smoke marking the fallen 109s. The sky seemed impossibly wide, empty, and yet charged with the echoes of violence that had just passed. Somewhere below, flak batteries remained silent, as if acknowledging the chaos had already been resolved. The bomber crew knew this day would be remembered, not for their formation, not for the flak dodged, but for the audacious action of the gunner in the tail. Harper did not feel like a hero. He felt drained, trembling, haunted by the near-impossible decision to suspend himself in that deadly position. But he also felt something heavier, understanding. He had glimpsed the fragile margin between life and death, between success and failure, and he had acted with precision in the eye of that margin. History would call it a suicidal maneuver, and the name was accurate, but it was also a measure of skill, daring and split-second genius. The German Luftwaffe pilots who survived would never forget the chaos. Their tactics, honed over years, had been shattered by one human element, one gunner's audacity and imagination. Reports filtered back to command centers that B-17 tail gunners were no longer predictable. Entire engagement doctrines would have to evolve. The impact of those 4 minutes would ripple across air combat strategy, forcing adjustments in approach angles, formation integrity, and defensive firepower. Harper's action had created a blueprint for survival and offensive innovation in a domain that had long been governed by rigid expectation. As Bellringer limped back toward friendly airspace, engines coughing, fuselage scarred, the crew silently acknowledged what had happened. Harper slumped in the tail compartment, body aching, eyes still scanning the sky for phantom threats. Around him, the sound of breathing, the distant whine of engines, and the faint hum of victory settled over the aircraft. In those minutes, 12 fighters had been destroyed, countless lives preserved, and the very nature of air combat irrevocably altered. And in that exhausted, silent aftermath, the truth was undeniable. One gunner's courage, one unconventional move, had changed history. The roar of the bomber's engines was uneven, ragged, yet alive with the sound of survival. Bellringer had emerged from the chaos, battered but intact. Inside the fuselage, the crew sat in a tense quiet, each man processing the storm that had just passed above northern Germany. Smoke still trailed from the wings, frost clung stubbornly to the riveted metal, and the distant trails of destroyed Bf-109s marked the sky like scars. But in the tail, Sergeant William Harper was the focus of unspoken reverence. He had faced 12 enemy fighters alone, had broken every rule and had emerged victorious. The crew checked systems as they limped toward the English coast. Engines that sputtered through flak and stress now held barely. The navigator adjusted their course, keeping them clear of further enemy airfields. The radio operator sent cautious messages, confirming altitude, position, and the battered state of the bomber. Yet no one dared speak about the miraculous act of survival that had unfolded just minutes before. Words felt inadequate, insufficient to describe the precision, courage, and near-impossible feat Harper had performed. Harper, meanwhile, slumped back into the tail seat, muscles trembling, lungs burning. His fingers were raw, scraped by the gun handles and metal edges of the compartment. He flexed them slowly, testing for function, while the cold seeped back into his bones. For all the horror of the last 4 minutes, he felt a strange clarity. He had acted decisively in a moment when hesitation would have meant death, not just his own but that of his entire crew. The lesson was visceral. Improvisation could overcome rigid training, instinct could outmatch experience, and audacity could shape history. Back at the base, reports trickled into command. Lieutenant Maddox recounted the engagement with deliberate caution, emphasizing how Harper's maneuver had allowed the bomber to survive overwhelming odds. Debriefings would later confirm that 12 enemy fighters had been destroyed or forced down, an extraordinary outcome in any engagement. Intelligence officers scratched their heads, analyzing how a single gunner's actions could destabilize an entire Luftwaffe squadron, yet they recorded it meticulously, noting the significance for future bomber missions. Within weeks, Harper's suicidal maneuver became a reference point. Tactics manuals were quietly updated, training adjusted to account for tail gunners capable of unconventional angles of fire. Pilots were taught to anticipate adaptive, fluid defense rather than static arcs. While the maneuver itself was dangerous and not recommended as standard procedure, the principle was clear. Ingenuity in combat could redefine survivability. Harper's action proved that innovation under pressure was as vital as firepower or numbers. For the bomber crews themselves, the experience became legend. The story of a lone gunner twisting his body into a deadly, almost impossible position spread quietly among airmen, whispered over mess halls and between missions. It was not just a tale of survival, it was a blueprint for courage, presence of mind, and the willingness to act decisively when all seemed lost. Crews spoke of it with awe, not hero worship but acknowledgement of what a single individual could accomplish in moments of extreme peril. Harper's personal reflection was quieter, deeper, and more measured. He understood that luck and skill had intertwined. He had survived because he had prepared, because he had learned the angles, studied patterns, and trusted his instincts. Yet he also knew that every second had been a gamble, and that countless others had died trying similar feats. The weight of those lives, the memory of lost comrades, remained with him, shaping his understanding of responsibility in combat. Courage, he realized, was not about recklessness, it was about calculated risk taken with full awareness of consequences. The impact of that day rippled beyond the crew and the bomber. Air combat doctrines began to shift subtly but significantly. Enemy pilots, observing reports and debriefs, reconsidered attack patterns, wary of tail gunners who no longer adhered to predictable rules. Escort fighters benefited indirectly, as formations tightened differently and defensive strategies evolved. Harper's maneuver, seemingly small in the grand theater of war, had altered perceptions, tactics, and the calculus of risk. Yet above all, the human element remained central. Machines were deadly, engines faltered, bullets flew, but it was the determination, quick thinking, and adaptability of one individual that had changed the course of the engagement. 12 Bf-109s downed, countless lives saved, and the bomber returned home, not merely intact but transformed in meaning. It was proof that history often hinged on moments that were unpredictable, improvisational, and deeply human. By the time Bellringer touched down on English soil, the tail compartment was empty of adrenaline but full of awareness. Harper stepped down, body sore, muscles stiff, but mind alive with reflection. The crew gathered around him silently, exchanging looks that conveyed respect far beyond words. That day, a single gunner had done what no standard tactics or manuals could achieve. He had transformed desperation into victory, vulnerability into innovation, and a 4-minute battle into a lasting legend. Harper's suicidal maneuver was not simply a historical footnote. It became a study in courage under fire, a case of ingenuity that demonstrated the intersection of skill, audacity, and timing. It showed that in war, as in life, moments of extreme pressure could reveal capacities that seemed impossible, rewriting what was believed to be achievable. As night fell over the airfield, the survivors walked in silence among the frost-bitten hangars, the distant hum of engines fading into memory. Harper paused once, glancing skyward. Somewhere above, empty sky and clouds held the echoes of tracers, smoke, and flame. 12 enemy fighters had fallen, and the world of air combat had changed. A single man's courage had made that difference. The legend of Sergeant William Harper would endure not for the violence of war, but for the audacity, precision, and humanity that had turned a desperate 4-minute encounter into a defining moment, one that reshaped tactics, preserved lives, and cemented a place in history that could never be erased. The sky had returned to silence, but its memory lingered, tracers, smoke trails, and the echo of 12 German fighters vanquished in 4 impossible minutes. On the ground, Bellringer's crew disembarked, their steps slow and deliberate, the adrenaline of survival giving way to quiet reflection. Sergeant William Harper moved among them, body aching, face streaked with frost and grime, yet his eyes held a calm born of having stared into death and returned unbroken. He knew that what had happened was more than a moment of survival, it was a reshaping of what was possible in aerial warfare. Historians would later describe the maneuver as suicidal, as if daring to stretch beyond the bounds of safety and training could be measured merely by danger. But those who had witnessed it understood differently. It was not recklessness, it was calculation, instinct, and a refusal to surrender to fear. Harper had become a fulcrum in the battle, tipping the scales of life and death through sheer will, precision, and courage. Every twist of his body, every measured burst of his guns, was a testament to human ingenuity in the most unforgiving environment imaginable, the high, cold skies of war. The consequences of his actions rippled far beyond that single engagement. Bomber crews carried the story forward, teaching future tail gunners to adapt, to anticipate, to innovate. Luftwaffe tactics shifted subtly in response, formations altering, angles reconsidered. Air combat was no longer merely a test of firepower and numbers. It was a contest of adaptability, creativity, and the courage to act decisively when all else failed. Harper's 4 minutes had rewritten the rules, proving that a single individual, armed with skill and audacity, could change the course of battle. Yet amidst the legend, Harper carried a quiet awareness of fragility. He had survived, but many did not. He had glimpsed the razor's edge where life and death meet, and he understood that heroism is inseparable from risk, loss, and consequence. That understanding, tempered with humility, became as enduring as the story itself. Decades later, the skies remain the same, indifferent and vast. But the legacy of that day endures in every formation, in every gunner who learns to think beyond the standard arc, in every pilot who understands the weight of instinct in the split-second decision. Harper's act is a reminder. History is not written solely by generals or machinery, but by individuals willing to confront impossibility with clarity, courage, and resolve. As the sun set over the English airfield, casting long shadows over frost-covered hangars, one image remained: a lone tail gunner, suspended in a deadly position, firing with precision and determination, altering the course of combat forever. The roar of engines, the flash of gunfire, and the fall of enemy fighters faded into memory, but the lesson endured. Courage, ingenuity, and human will can redefine the impossible. In the history of air combat, that day, and that man, would never be forgotten.